Hi guys, this is the Stick Figure Historian, and we're about to get started on another episode of the Scotland series. Last time, I told you about how Thomas Randolph took Edinburgh Castle. With the help of William Francis, of course, who needs to not get left out of the story. And then we visited Stirling Castle, which was under siege by Edward Bruce. Edward ended up striking a deal with the commander there, Philip de Mowbray, that if no English troops came to relieve the siege by June 24th, that Mowbray would surrender the castle to him. Well, let's just say that Robert Bruce was not really excited about the whole deal when he found out about it. He had been hoping to avoid a major battle with the English, or at least put it off until a more convenient time. But this agreement had most inconveniently hastened the day of reckoning. Edward II of England was driving forward like a madman to make the deadline to relieve Stirling Castle, with the usual overwhelming force of knights on their destriers. Bruce's greatest exertions could only bring together a mere 7,000 to cope with King Edward's 20. And, as usual, only 500 of these Scottish troops were properly mounted as cavalry. And when I say that Edward of England was driving like a madman, I don't exaggerate. His soldiers had very little time to eat or rest, but were forced to march for scores of miles, almost without halting. Thus, it was not a very vigorous army that drew up before the Bannock Burn on June 23rd, however powerful their numbers would make them to appear. We may say that it was a foolish move on the part of the English king, but really, he did not have much choice. Had he gone any slower, he would have missed the deadline to relieve the castle. Even as it was, he had preceded it by just one day. Before I begin to tell you of this great battle, it is important that we should look a bit at the geography of where it took place, for that will help us to understand better what transpired. The two armies faced each other across the Bannock Burn, as I mentioned earlier, with the Scots to the north of it and the English on the southern bank. This burn flows into the River Forth, forming the eastern barrier of the battlefield. It's kind of interesting to note here how close this battlefield is to Stirling Bridge, where Andrew Murray and William Wallace won their great victory about 17 years prior to this. To the west was the forest of New Park, and just beyond the Scots to the north stood Stirling Castle, strong and tall upon its rocky foundation. To put it simply, the only thing standing betwixt the two foes at present was the Bannock Burn, for which this battle would come to be named. There was no time for the weary English troops to rest. They must at least make an appearance before the castle walls to prove they had come to Mowbray's relief. Edward II ordered them to cross the burn at two different points. Gilbert de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester, and Humphrey de Bohun, the Earl of Hereford, would ford by way of the ancient Roman road, along which they had marched much of their weary way. And in the meantime, our old acquaintance Robert Clifford and his comrade Henry de Beaumont would try to cross further east, closer to the River Forth. Neither side exactly knew where their foe was at this point. Of course, they knew that they must inevitably meet, but neither the Scots nor English expected to meet on this particular day. Thus, as Gloucester and Hereford were splashing their way across the burn, Robert Bruce was just emerging from the New Park Wood on a scouting expedition with a small force of his men. He was clad in some of his lightest armor, and rode a bit ahead and apart from them, for he had not really expected to meet so closely with the enemy. Imagine, then, his surprise, and that of the English, when they found they were so near. When one of the knights in the English army, Sir Henry de Bohun, who was actually nephew to the Earl of Hereford, saw the Scottish king thus alone and so lightly armed, he was seized with a sudden, wild idea. If he should capture or kill the king, then the war against the Scots could perhaps be won in a single stroke. He dug his spurs into his warhorse's flanks and lowered his lance, bearing down with fury upon Bruce. The king sat still on his little grey pony, quietly watching the daring Sir Henry closely for a moment. Suddenly, he too began to gallop forward. And yet he had no lance such as Sir Henry had, nor even so much as a sword. The only weapons he carried were his battle-axe and his courage. Thus the two warriors thundered down upon each other, while their friends watched in shock and awe. Just when the point of the lance should have struck upon Bruce's breast, he swerved his pony aside, so that it missed him by a deathly inch. With perfect speed his axe swung about, and dealt his foe a crushing blow. Sir Henry fell dead. The Scots, goaded to excitement by the bravery of their king, surged forward towards the English earls, chasing them with little trouble back to the other side of the burn again. And what did Bruce say when the Scottish nobles and leaders chided him about how foolish it was for him to go near the enemy, so lightly armed and alone? He only smiled, and remarked what a pity it was that he had broken his best axe. There is another version of this famous story, I must add, which is told to us by the English chroniclers. They would have it that as Sir Henry rode towards the king, he suddenly saw that Bruce was not alone, but rather accompanied by several of his friends, who suddenly emerged from the woods. And thus he began to turn and ride back towards the English earls. The story then says that when Bruce saw Sir Henry retreat thus, he put spurs to his mount and rode him down, slaying him as he fled, and that the Scots accompanying the king went so far as to murder Sir Henry's poor squire as well. As to if this or the former version is true, I cannot tell for certain. I'll be honest, I tend to be a little biased in favor of the Scots. Just a wee bit, you know. But honestly, I've got to say, I think the first story is a lot more logical than the second one. But what of Clifford and Beaumont? Those two English commanders got a bit nearer to Stirling Castle than the earls had, but not for long. As they began to cross the open field that lay between them and the castle, They were spotted by Thomas Randolph and his trusty division of spearmen. The very moment they were seen spelled their doom. This was not the whole of the English army, but only a very little part of it, and a weary part at that. They could not hope to withstand the fury of the fresh Scottish troops. Thus it was that not much had changed when the sun went down on June 23rd. Philip de Mowbray still held Stirling Castle, and both Scots and English occupied their original sites of the burn. Yet the battle was not over. The coming of the night had only postponed its conclusion. There was still no rest for the haggard English troops. Under the cover of darkness, Edward II finally managed to move his hordes over the rushing burn and into the marshy field of New Plain. They did not dare get any closer to Stirling Castle than this, for fear of rousing the Scots. They would have to fight their way there in the morning. There was no other way. At last, they caught what little bit of sleep they could upon the damp and chilly ground. In the midst of all the hustle and bustle of the English camp that night, one man slipped away unnoticed by his comrades. One Alexander Seaton. Seaton was a Scotsman, I am sorry to say, who had gone over to fight for the English. At this last moment, he had decided to desert the English cause and join his brothers once more. The following morning he went to Bruce himself and strongly urged him to make the first move and attack the foe that day. For despite their greater numbers, the English were very weary, and after their defeat the previous day, had no great confidence that they could truly hold the field against the fierce Scots. Thus, the Scots rose with the sun and set themselves in array, with the forest of New Park and Stirling Castle to their rear, and the foe before them. The culmination of 17 long years of the fight for freedom was about to unfold along the banks of the Bannock Burn.